In the shadow of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where ancient Cherokee spirits still whispered through the pines, a single act of mercy would ignite a conflict that would stain the snow crimson. This is the story of Joseph Ridge Walker, a man caught between two worlds, and Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, a woman whose salvation would cost more than either of them could imagine. When the sacred meets the forbidden, when honor collides with survival, sometimes saving one life means destroying everything else. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind screamed down from the peaks like a banshee's wail, carrying with it the promise of death wrapped in crystalline fury. March of 1838 had turned treacherous in the North Carolina mountains, where spring should have been painting the valleys green, but instead winter clung with desperate claws to every ridge and hollow. Through this maelstrom rode Joseph Ridge Walker, though few would have recognized the lone figure hunched against his horse's neck as he guided the animal through drifts that reached the gelding's belly. Joe's Cherokee blood sang with the rhythm of the storm, reading its moods the way his grandmother Mary Corn Tassel had taught him to read the flight patterns of hawks. But his white father's pragmatism kept him moving when ancient wisdom might have counseled shelter. The monthly supply run to Mill Creek settlement couldn't wait for better weather. Not when his uncle Samuel Ridge and the remaining families in Akota Springs needed the medicines and ammunition that only gold could buy, and only Joe could obtain without raising suspicion. His mixed heritage made him a ghost in both worlds. Too Cherokee for the white settlements, too white for some of the traditional council members, yet useful to both when convenience demanded. The saddlebags draped across his mount's flanks carried Cherokee gold, traded for supplies that would help his people survive another month in these mountains while the removal agents prowled the valleys below like wolves scenting blood. The settlement of Mill Creek huddled against the mountainside like a collection of children's blocks scattered by an angry giant. Smoke rose from perhaps a dozen chimneys, gray fingers clawing at the lowering sky. Joe dismounted at Caldwell's general store, his boots crunching through snow that had turned to ice beneath the weight of countless footsteps. The building squatted between the newly constructed schoolhouse and the trading post, its windows glowing amber in the storm's premature twilight. Henry Caldwell looked up from his ledger as Joe stamped his feet on the threshold, snow cascading from his wool coat. The merchant's eyes held that familiar mixture of wariness and greed that Joe had learned to navigate carefully. Caldwell wanted Cherokee gold, but feared Cherokee vengeance, a delicate balance that had kept their business relationship profitable, if not pleasant. Ridge Walker, Caldwell nodded, the greeting neither warm nor hostile. Didn't expect to see you in this weather. Roads are getting mighty dangerous with all the military traffic lately. Joe set a small leather pouch on the counter, the gold coins inside singing their subtle song of commerce. Need supplies, the usual list. He produced a carefully written inventory, aware that his ability to read and write in both English and Cherokee syllabary made some men nervous. Education in an Indian was either a tool or a threat, depending on who held the pen. As Caldwell gathered the requested items, dried goods and medical supplies mostly, Joe's attention was drawn to voices raised in heated discussion near the pot-bellied stove. Captain William Hayes, the settlement's de facto leader and former cavalry officer, stood with his back to the fire, his weathered face flushed with more than just heat. "I'm telling you, Webb, sending that girl up to teach the children is a mistake," Hayes was saying, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "These mountains aren't safe for a woman alone, especially not with the Cherokee getting restless about the removal orders." Dr. Marcus Webb, a thin man with intelligent eyes and prematurely gray hair, shook his head firmly. "Miss Morrison is a qualified teacher, and these children need proper education. Besides, she's supposed to arrive tomorrow morning with the supply wagon, weather permitting, of course." Hayes snorted, glancing toward the window where snow continued to pile against the glass. Weather like this, that wagon might not make it through Thunder Gap, and if it does, she'd be stranded here until spring thaw opens the roads again. Joe finished his business with Caldwell, sliding the supplies into his saddlebags with practiced efficiency. He had no interest in the white settlement's domestic concerns, but something about the conversation nagged at him as he prepared to brave the storm once more. Thunder Gap was treacherous even in good weather, a narrow mountain pass, where Cherokee warriors had once ambushed cavalry patrols. In a blizzard like this, it became a death trap. The ride back toward Cherokee territory took him along the ridge road that skirted Thunder Gap, a route that offered some protection from the worst of the wind. Joe had traveled perhaps half the distance when his horse suddenly lifted its head. Ears pricked forward with alert tension. Through the howling of the storm came another sound, faint but unmistakable, the desperate neighing of a horse in distress. Joe reined in his mount, straining his senses against the white chaos surrounding him. There, below the ridge where the road curved toward the gap, he glimpsed movement. A wagon, overturned in the snow, its canvas covering whipping like a wounded bird in the gale. One horse lay motionless in the traces while the other thrashed frantically, trying to break free from the wreckage. Without conscious thought, Joe guided his horse down the treacherous slope, the animal's hooves sliding and scrambling for purchase on the ice-slicked rocks. As he drew closer, he could see that the wagon had skidded off the narrow road and rolled, spilling its contents across the snow. Barrels and crates lay scattered like dice, their contents freezing in the bitter air. But it was the flash of blue fabric beneath the wagon's tilted bed that made Joe's heart clench with sudden urgency. Someone was trapped under there, and from the stillness of the form, they might already be beyond help. Joe dismounted and waded through the knee-deep snow, his breath forming clouds that the wind snatched away instantly. The woman pinned beneath. The wagon's edge was young, perhaps 25, with auburn hair that had escaped from a practical bun to frame a face pale with cold and unconsciousness. Her traveling dress, once a respectable navy blue, was now torn and stained with snow and blood from a gash across her forehead. A leather satchel lay beside her, its contents scattered, books, writing materials, and papers that were rapidly becoming illegible in the storm. Joe knelt beside her, pressing his ear to her chest. Her heartbeat was faint but steady, her breathing shallow. Hypothermia was setting in, but she was alive. He examined the wagon's position carefully, noting how its weight rested partially on her legs. One wrong move in lifting, it could cause further injury, but leaving her trapped meant certain death. Working with methodical precision, Joe used a broken axle piece as a lever, gradually lifting the wagon's edge while pulling the woman free. She moaned softly as he moved her, a sound that was more reassuring than alarming. Unconsciousness might actually be protecting her from the worst of the pain. The storm was intensifying, and Joe knew that getting the woman to shelter was now a matter of life or death. His own cabin at Eagle's Perch was only a few miles away, but reaching it in these conditions while carrying an injured person would test even his mountain skills. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The alternative was attempting to make it back to Mill Creek Settlement, a longer journey that would expose them both to the storm's full fury. Joe made his decision with the swift certainty that had kept him alive through 32 winters. In these mountains, he wrapped the woman in his own heavy coat and several blankets from the wagon's scattered cargo, then lifted her across his horse's saddle. The animal protested the extra weight and awkward burden, but Joe's steady voice and firm hands calmed the beast's nervousness. The journey to Eagle's Perch became a nightmare of white blindness and numbing cold. Joe walked beside his horse, one hand on the reins and the other steadying his unconscious burden, while the wind tried to tear them all from the narrow mountain path. Several times he lost the trail entirely, relying on instinct and half-remembered landmarks to guide them through the storm. When the dark bulk of his cabin finally emerged from the swirling snow, Joe felt a relief so profound it made his knees weak. The one-room structure, perched on a rocky ledge like an eagle's nest, which had given it its name, offered solid walls and a stone chimney that promised warmth and life. Joe carried the woman inside and laid her on his bed, a simple frame strung with rope and covered with buffalo robes and wool blankets. The cabin was cold, the fire having died to embers hours ago, but it offered blessed protection from the wind's relentless assault. Working quickly, Joe built up the fire until flames danced high in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the cabin's rough-hewn walls. Only then did he allow himself to truly examine his unexpected guest. She was young and clearly educated, if the scattered books were any indication. Her clothes, though now ruined by the accident, had been well-made and practical rather than fashionable. This was likely the schoolteacher Captain Hayes had mentioned, the woman who was supposed to arrive in Mill Creek Settlement. The irony was not lost on Joe. Here he was, a Cherokee man whose people were being driven from these very mountains, saving the life of a white woman who had come to teach white children. The removal agents would see this as validation of their claims that Indians were dangerous and unpredictable. Some of his own people might view it as betrayal, helping those who were displacing them. But as Joe carefully cleaned the wound on the woman's forehead and wrapped her in warm blankets, such political considerations seemed distant and irrelevant. This was simply a human being in need of help, and his grandmother had taught him that turning away from suffering was a sin against the Creator, regardless of the sufferer's race or circumstances. The woman stirred as warmth began to penetrate her chilled body, her eyelids fluttering but not quite opening. Joe prepared a weak broth from dried venison and wild herbs, knowing that she would need nourishment when she fully regained consciousness. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but inside the cabin, life was slowly asserting itself over death. As Joe settled into a chair beside the bed to keep watch through the night, he wondered what consequences this act of mercy might bring. He had crossed an invisible line by bringing a white woman to his isolated cabin, and both their communities would have strong opinions about what had transpired here. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, his only concern was keeping them both alive until the storm passed. The fire crackled and hissed as snow found its way down the chimney, and the wind sang its ancient song around the cabin's eaves. In the bed, the woman's breathing grew stronger and more regular, her body beginning to win its battle against the cold. Joe allowed himself to hope that she might survive, even as he wondered if her survival might ultimately doom them both. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison's first conscious sensation was warmth, a blessed heat that seemed to seep into her bones after what felt like an eternity of cold. Her second was the unfamiliar scent of wood smoke mixed with something else, something earthy and wild that she couldn't identify. As consciousness returned fully, she became aware of lying on something soft and comfortable, covered by blankets that felt like fur against her skin. Memory came flooding back in fragments, the wagon sliding on the icy road, the sickening sensation of rolling down the slope, the crushing weight across her legs, and then darkness. She should be dead frozen beneath an overturned wagon in the middle of nowhere. Instead, she was warm and apparently safe, though she had no idea where she might be. Sarah opened her eyes cautiously, expecting to see the familiar walls of a settler's cabin or perhaps the interior of Mill Creek's doctor's office. Instead, she found herself in a single room that was both rustic and strangely comfortable. The walls were built of massive logs chinked with clay and moss, and the floor was covered with what appeared to be animal pelts arranged with careful precision. A fire burned in a stone hearth that dominated one wall, casting dancing shadows across the room's simple furnishings. There was a table made from a single massive slab of wood, chairs carved from solid timber, and shelves holding an odd mixture of items, books written in an alphabet she didn't recognize, clay pots decorated with intricate patterns, and various implements whose purposes she could only guess. But it was the man sitting in a chair beside her bed who drew her attention and held it. He was perhaps 30 years old, with the kind of lean strength that came from a life of physical labor rather than soft living. His skin was bronze-tinted, and his dark hair was longer than fashion dictated among white men, though it was neatly tied back with a leather cord. His features were strong and angular, with high cheekbones and eyes the color of dark amber that seemed to hold both intelligence and wariness. When he noticed she was awake, he rose with fluid grace and moved to the table, returning with a cup that steamed with aromatic warmth. "Drink this," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that softened the consonants. "It will help with the cold that's still in your bones." Sarah struggled to sit up, wincing as pain shot through her ribs and legs. The man quickly moved to support her, his touch gentle but impersonal as he helped arrange pillows behind her back. She accepted the cup gratefully, inhaling the rich scent of what appeared to be herbal tea mixed with something that might have been honey. "Thank you," she managed, her voice hoarse from cold and shock. "I'm Sarah Morrison. I think my wagon must have crashed in the storm." "Joseph Ridge Walker," he replied with a slight nod. "And yes, your wagon went off the road near Thunder Gap. You're lucky to be alive." The name meant nothing to Sarah, but something in his manner suggested there were layers of meaning she wasn't grasping. "Where am I? How far are we from Mill Creek Settlement?" "About 8 miles by the Ridge Trail, but the storm has made the roads impassable. We'll be staying here until it clears." Joseph returned to his chair, maintaining a careful distance that Sarah found both respectful and somehow sad. "We?" Sarah looked around the cabin again, noting details she had missed before. This was clearly a man's dwelling, with none of the touches that would indicate a woman's presence. The implications of her situation began to sink in, along with a growing awareness of the social complexities involved. "You needed shelter and medical attention," Joseph said simply, as if reading her thoughts. "The alternative was letting you freeze to death under that wagon." Sarah studied his face, trying to read the emotions there. His rescue of her had been an act of pure mercy, she realized, one that might have significant consequences for both of them. A white woman alone with an Indian man, even one who spoke English and lived in a proper cabin, would raise eyebrows and tongues in any frontier community. "You're Cherokee," she said, not quite making it a question. "Half Cherokee," he corrected. "My father was white, my mother Cherokee. I learned to live in both worlds, though I'm not entirely welcome in either." The honest pain in his voice touched something in Sarah's heart. She had come west to teach children, to make a difference in a frontier community that needed education. The idea that this man who had saved her life was somehow caught between two worlds seemed profoundly unfair. "I was supposed to be the new schoolteacher in Mill Creek," she said, hoping to shift the conversation to safer ground. "Dr. Webb hired me to teach the children there." Joseph nodded, unsurprised. "I heard them discussing your arrival at Caldwell's store." Captain Hayes wasn't pleased about a woman traveling alone in these mountains. "Captain Hayes will be even less pleased when he learns where I spent the storm," Sarah said with a wry smile that didn't quite hide her concern. Joseph's expression grew serious. "There will be talk about both of us. My people are already under suspicion, and bringing a white woman to my cabin won't improve their opinion of Cherokee intentions." The weight of their situation settled over them, both like the storm clouds outside. They were trapped together, not just by weather, but by social expectations and racial tensions that neither had created, but both would have to navigate. Sarah found herself studying Joseph's face again, noting the intelligence in his eyes and the careful way he chose his words. This was not the savage Indian of frontier stories, but an educated man caught in circumstances beyond his control. "I'm grateful you saved my life," Sarah said quietly. "Whatever consequences we face, I want you to know that." Joseph met her gaze directly, and for a moment something passed between them, a recognition of shared humanity that transcended the artificial boundaries their societies had created. "Sometimes doing the right thing costs more than we expect to pay," he said. "But we pay it anyway, because the alternative is losing ourselves." Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault on the mountains, sealing them together in outside. This small cabin where two worlds had collided and somehow found common ground. Neither could know that their forced companionship would soon ignite a conflict that would stain the snow with blood and change the fate of everyone in these ancient hills. For now, there was only warmth, shelter, and the fragile beginning of understanding between two people who had every reason to mistrust each other, but were choosing not to. The second day dawned with deceptive clarity, the storm having exhausted itself against the mountain peaks during the night. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's single window, casting geometric patterns across the floor where frost had etched delicate ferns on the glass. Sarah woke to the sound of an axe biting into wood, a steady rhythm that spoke of purposeful labor. She tested her limbs carefully, finding that while her ribs ached and her legs bore impressive bruises, nothing seemed broken. The gash on her forehead had stopped bleeding, leaving only a tender reminder of how close she had come to death. Rising slowly, she wrapped one of Joseph's blankets around herself and moved to the window. Outside, Joseph was splitting firewood. With economical strokes, each swing precise and controlled. His breath formed white clouds in the frigid air, and she could see that he had already cleared a path from the cabin to what appeared to be a small stable built into the rock face. The storm had left nearly 3 feet of snow, transforming the landscape into something from a fairy tale, beautiful and treacherous in equal measure. Sarah became aware of her own appearance and circumstances with growing discomfort. Her traveling dress was ruined beyond repair, stained with blood and torn in several places. More pressing was the impropriety of her situation, though she recognized that social conventions held little weight when survival was at stake. When Joseph returned with an armload of split wood, he found her standing uncertainly by the window, clearly struggling with practical concerns she was reluctant to voice. He set the wood by the hearth and added several pieces to the fire before addressing her dilemma with matter-of-fact directness. "There's a shirt and trousers that might fit you," he said, nodding toward a wooden chest in the corner. "They belong to my father. Your dress needs mending, and you'll be warmer in wool and leather." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but practicality won over propriety. "Thank you. That's very thoughtful." She paused, then added, "I don't suppose there's any possibility of getting word to Mill Creek Settlement?" "They'll be worried when I don't arrive." Joseph's expression grew serious as he tended the fire. "The trail won't be passable for several days, maybe longer. The storm triggered an avalanche that blocked the main pass, and the ridge trail is too dangerous until the snow settles." He straightened, meeting her gaze directly. "I'm sorry, but we're trapped here until conditions improve." The implications hung between them unspoken but understood. Each day that passed would make their eventual explanation more difficult, their reputations more suspect. Sarah had heard enough frontier gossip to know how quickly scandal could spread, and how slowly it could be forgotten. "Will your people be concerned about your absence?" she asked, attempting to shift focus from her own predicament. "They'll assume I'm weathering the storm somewhere safe," Joseph replied, but Sarah caught the slight tension in his voice that suggested the situation was more complicated than he was admitting. As the morning progressed, they settled into a cautious routine. Joseph prepared meals with ingredients that seemed to appear from various hidden stores throughout the cabin, while Sarah mended what she could of her damaged belongings. The clothes he had offered proved surprisingly suitable once she rolled up the sleeves and legs, and the warmth of wool and leather was undeniably preferable to her ruined dress. Their conversation remained careful, touching on safe topics like the weather and the geography of the mountains. Yet beneath the polite exchanges, Sarah sensed deeper currents. Joseph moved through his domain with the confidence of a man completely at home in the wilderness, but she occasionally caught glimpses of something guarded in his manner, as if he were constantly calculating the implications of his words and actions. It was while helping him tend to his horse in the small stable that Sarah began to understand the complexity of his position. The animal was a fine specimen, clearly well cared for and valuable, but the saddle and bridle bore decorative beadwork that spoke of Cherokee craftsmanship. More telling were the supplies stored in the stable: ammunition, trading goods, and what appeared to be gold coins wrapped in doeskin pouches. "You trade between the communities," Sarah observed, not quite making it a question. Joseph nodded, continuing to brush his horse's coat with steady strokes. "Both sides need things the other has. Cherokee gold for white manufactured goods. It's profitable, and it keeps me useful to both communities. But it also makes you suspect to both," Sarah said with sudden insight. Joseph's hand stilled for a moment before resuming its rhythm. "Trust is a luxury I've learned to live without. Usefulness is more reliable." The loneliness in his voice touched something deep in Sarah's chest. She had come west partly to escape her own isolation, the suffocating expectations of Philadelphia society that had left her feeling like an outsider in her own life. The idea that this man had spent years navigating between two worlds, never fully belonging to either, awakened an unexpected sympathy. Their afternoon was interrupted by the distant sound of voices carried on the wind. Joseph immediately went alert, moving to the window with the fluid caution of a man accustomed to danger. Sarah joined him, peering through the glass at the white expanse below the cabin. 3 figures on horseback were making their way up the trail, their mounts struggling through the deep snow. Even at a distance, Sarah could see that they wore the blue uniforms of the Federal cavalry, and their purposeful movement suggested this was no casual patrol. "Removal agents," Joseph said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of bitter experience. "They're supposed to be registering Cherokee families for relocation, but mostly they're looking for excuses to confiscate property and arrest anyone who resists." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She had heard stories about the government's treatment of the Cherokee, but seeing the reality of armed men hunting human beings for the crime of wanting to remain in their ancestral homeland brought the injustice into sharp focus. "What will you do?" she asked. Joseph was already moving, gathering supplies with practiced efficiency. "Hide what needs hiding, and hope they're not interested in searching too thoroughly." He paused, looking at her with an expression that mixed regret with determination. "This complicates things. If they find you here, it won't go well for either of us." Sarah understood immediately. A white woman in a Cherokee cabin, wearing men's clothes and clearly having spent the night, would provide exactly the kind of scandal the removal agents needed to justify harsh measures against the local Cherokee population. Her presence here could endanger not just Joseph, but his entire community. "Tell me what to do," she said simply. Joseph's surprise at her immediate cooperation was evident, but he didn't waste time questioning it. "There's a root cellar beneath the floor, hidden under that rug. You'll need to stay quiet no matter what you hear." As hoofbeats grew closer, Joseph quickly concealed anything that might indicate Sarah's presence, while she gathered the borrowed clothes and her few possessions. The hiding place proved to be a cleverly disguised chamber carved from the living rock, large enough for a person to crouch in relative comfort, but invisible unless one knew exactly where to look. From her confined space, Sarah could hear everything that transpired above. The soldiers' boots stomped across the wooden floor as they entered without invitation, their voices loud with the arrogance of men backed by governmental authority. "Ridge Walker," came a voice Sarah didn't recognize, harsh with contempt. "Sergeant Dalton, 3rd Infantry. We're conducting inspections of all Cherokee dwellings in this district. My home is open to you, Joseph replied, his tone carefully neutral. Though I should mention that I'm only half Cherokee, and this cabin is built on land my white father purchased legally. That so? Another voice, younger and more aggressive. Papers prove that, do they? Sarah heard the rustle of documents being produced and examined. She pressed her ear closer to the floor, straining to follow the conversation that would determine both their fates. Seems in order, Sergeant Dalton admitted grudgingly. But we've had reports of suspicious activity in these mountains. Cherokee resistance, they say, meetings and such. I keep to myself, Joseph said evenly. Trading and hunting mostly, no involvement in politics. See, that's interesting, the younger voice interjected. Because word is you've been seen in town recently, buying supplies. More supplies than one man needs. Makes a fellow wonder who else you might be feeding. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Sarah realized that her own survival might have provided exactly the evidence these men needed to arrest Joseph, or worse. The irony was bitter, that his act of mercy could be twisted into proof of criminal conspiracy. I stock up before winter, Joseph replied calmly. The roads are unreliable, as you've no doubt noticed. Sarah heard furniture being moved, drawers opened and closed, the systematic sounds of a thorough search. She held her breath as boots passed directly over her hiding place, certain that the soldiers must be able to hear her racing heartbeat through the wooden floor. What's this? Came Dalton's voice, sharp with interest. Books, Joseph answered. I read. In Cherokee script, the sergeant said with obvious distaste. Thought you said you kept out of politics. Learning to read my mother's language isn't political, Sergeant. It's personal. The conversation continued, growing more tense as the soldiers found additional items that aroused their suspicion. Sarah realized that Joseph was walking the tightrope, answering their questions truthfully while revealing as little as possible about his activities or loyalties. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably less than one, the sounds of the search ceased. We'll be keeping an eye on this area, Sergeant Dalton warned. Any Cherokee resistance activities, any meetings or suspicious gatherings, and you'll find yourself on the road to Oklahoma, whether you've got white blood or not. Understood, Joseph replied with the same careful neutrality he had maintained throughout the encounter. The soldiers departed with much stamping and muttering, their voices fading as they made their way back down the mountain trail. Sarah remained, hidden until Joseph tapped on the floor above her head, the agreed-upon signal that it was safe to emerge. When she climbed out of the root cellar, she found Joseph sitting at his table with his head in his hands, the strain of the encounter finally showing. The careful organization of his cabin had been destroyed, belongings scattered and furniture overturned in the soldiers' search for evidence of Cherokee resistance. I'm sorry, Sarah said quietly. My being here put you in danger. Joseph looked up, and she was surprised to see not anger in his eyes, but a kind of resigned sadness. It's not your fault. They would have found some excuse to be suspicious. They always do. As they worked together to restore order to the cabin, Sarah began to understand the constant pressure under which Joseph lived. Every action was scrutinized, every possession questioned, every relationship examined for signs of disloyalty to a government that had already decided his people had no right to exist where they were. How do you stand it? She asked as they righted the overturned table. You learn to bend without breaking, Joseph replied. Like the trees in winter storms. Rigid things snap, but flexible things survive. The philosophy behind his words struck Sarah as profoundly sad. This was a man who had been forced to make himself small, to hide his true self behind masks of usefulness and compliance, simply to survive in the world into which he had been born. As evening fell and they prepared Another simple meal from Joseph's dwindling supplies. Sarah found herself studying her rescuer with new eyes. He was not the savage her Philadelphia upbringing had taught her to fear, nor the noble primitive of romantic literature. He was simply a human being trying to navigate an impossible situation with as much dignity as circumstances allowed. The realization marked a turning point in her understanding, not just of Joseph, but of the larger tragedy unfolding in these mountains. She had come west with the abstract notion of bringing civilization to the frontier, but now she was beginning to question what civilization meant when it required the destruction of people like Joseph Ridge Walker. Outside, the wind picked up again, promising another night of storm and isolation. But inside the cabin, as Sarah and Joseph shared their evening meal by the light of the fire, something had shifted between them. The careful politeness was giving way to something more honest, more human. They were no longer just a Cherokee man and a white woman thrown together by circumstance, but two people discovering that they shared more than either had expected. The third morning brought news that would change everything. Sarah woke to find Joseph already dressed and preparing to leave, his face grave with purpose she hadn't seen before. "My cousin David should have checked on me by now," he explained, securing a knife at his belt. "When the storm cleared, he would have ridden up from Dakota Springs. If he hasn't come, something is wrong." Sarah felt a chill of premonition that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "How long will you be gone?" "A few hours, if all is well. Longer if it's not." Joseph paused at the door, his amber eyes serious. "If anyone comes while I'm away, use the root cellar. Don't trust anyone in uniform, and don't trust anyone who claims to be friendly. Out here, friendly strangers are often the most dangerous kind." After he left, Sarah found herself alone with her thoughts for the first time since the wagon accident. The silence of the cabin pressed around her, broken only by the occasional crack of settling timbers and the distant call of mountain birds. She used the solitude to examine her situation more clearly, and what she saw troubled her deeply. In Philadelphia, she had been Miss Sarah Morrison, spinster schoolteacher, slightly past the age when marriage was expected and slightly too independent from most men's comfort. Her decision to come west had been born partly of adventure, but mostly of necessity, as teaching positions for unmarried women were becoming scarce in the increasingly competitive eastern cities. Now she was something else entirely, something that had no proper name in polite society. She was a white woman who had spent 3 days alone with a Cherokee man, sharing his bed as an invalid, wearing his clothes, eating his food. The scandal would follow her wherever she went, making her previous social isolation seem like luxury by comparison. But as troubling as her social predicament was, Sarah found herself more concerned about Joseph's situation. His careful neutrality, his walking the line between two hostile communities, his willingness to risk everything to save a stranger's life, all spoke to a character that deserved better than the suspicion and hatred that seemed to follow him everywhere. She was still pondering these thoughts when she heard the sound of approaching horses, multiple animals moving at speed up the mountain trail. This was not Joseph returning, she realized with quick alarm. This was something else, something that made her heart race with instinctive fear. Moving carefully to the window, Sarah peered through the glass and felt her blood turn to ice water. 6 Cherokee warriors were approaching the cabin, their faces painted for war, weapons clearly visible. At their head rode a young man whose bearing and the deference of the others marked him as their leader. This must be David Kingfisher, Joseph's cousin, but the man approaching looked nothing like the reasonable family member she had imagined. Sarah barely had time to scramble into the root cellar before the warriors reached the cabin. From her hiding place, she could hear them enter with none of the respectful caution the federal soldiers had shown. These men moved through Joseph's home as if they owned it, their voices speaking rapid Cherokee punctuated by words that needed no translation. When David Kingfisher finally spoke in English, his voice carried a fury that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Where is he? Where is the betrayer who brings white soldiers to Cherokee lands?" The words were clearly directed at someone, and Sarah realized with horror that they must have found evidence of her presence despite Joseph's careful concealment. A piece of her torn dress, perhaps, or some other telltale sign that a white woman had been here. "Search everything," David commanded. "Find what he's hiding." The sounds above Sarah's head became chaotic as the warriors tore through the cabin with far less restraint than the Federal soldiers had shown. Furniture crashed, pottery shattered, and she could hear books being torn apart as the men sought evidence of Joseph's supposed treachery. "Here," called one of the warriors in heavily accented English. "White woman clothes, hidden in the chest." Sarah's heart sank as she realized they had found her ruined dress, the one Joseph had tried to preserve by cleaning and mending it. In Cherokee hands, it would be proof positive that Joseph had been harboring a white woman, consorting with the enemy while his people faced extermination. "So," David's voice was deadly quiet now, "my cousin has been entertaining white guests while Cherokee children starve and Cherokee elders freeze in the mountains. While Federal soldiers hunt our families like animals, Joseph Ridge Walker shares his warm cabin with white women." The interpretation of the evidence was exactly what Sarah had feared, and exactly wrong. But from David's perspective, she realized, the conclusion would seem inescapable. Joseph had disappeared on the same day a white woman's wagon was found, wrecked near Cherokee territory. Now her clothes were hidden in his cabin. To David, it would look like deliberate collaboration with the enemy. "When he returns," David continued, "we will have words with the half-blood about where his loyalties truly lie." The warriors settled in to wait, and Sarah found herself trapped not just physically, but in a web of misunderstanding that could destroy Joseph even if she managed to explain the truth. Her presence here, which had begun as a simple rescue, was becoming the very evidence that Joseph's enemies needed to brand him a traitor to his own people. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. The warriors talked among themselves in Cherokee, their voices rising and falling with the rhythm of men sharing old grievances and nursing ancient wounds. Sarah caught enough English words to understand that they were discussing recent raids by Federal troops, families arrested and property confiscated, children separated from parents in the chaos of forced relocation. When she heard these stories, Sarah began to understand the depth of rage that drove David Kingfisher and his followers. These were not savage raiders seeking random violence, but desperate men fighting for the survival of their people against overwhelming odds. That they would see Joseph's apparent collaboration with a white woman as the ultimate betrayal made perfect sense from their perspective. The afternoon was wearing toward evening when the sound of a single horse announced Joseph's return. Sarah pressed her ear to the floor, straining to hear every word of what she knew would be a confrontation that could cost Joseph his life. "Cousin," Joseph's voice came clearly through the floorboards, carefully neutral despite what must have been his shock at finding armed warriors in his cabin. "Betrayer," David replied without preamble. "Did you think we wouldn't discover your white woman? Did you think Cherokee blood meant so little that you could warm her bed while Cherokee children freeze in the caves?" "You don't understand the situation," Joseph said calmly, though Sarah could hear the tension beneath his controlled tone. "I understand enough," David snapped. "I understand that while you were supposed to be trading for supplies our people need, you were instead playing white man's games with white man's women. I understand that Federal soldiers have been asking questions about a missing white woman, and now I understand where she's been hiding." Sarah felt sick with the realization that her rescue had created exactly the kind of scandal that would give the Federal authorities excuse for even harsher measures against the Cherokee. She could imagine the headlines in Eastern newspapers. The righteous outrage about white women being kidnapped by savage Indians. The truth that Joseph had saved her life at considerable risk to himself would be lost in the larger narrative of racial fear and hatred. She needed help, Joseph said simply. Her wagon crashed in the storm. I couldn't leave her to die. You could have brought her to the white settlement, David countered. You could have left her for the white soldiers to find. Instead, you brought her here to Cherokee land and kept her hidden like a guilty secret. The roads were impassable, Joseph protested. She would have died if I had tried to move her that far. Better she should die than Cherokee children should suffer for your choices, David said with brutal honesty. Her people are driving us from our homes, stealing our land, destroying our families, and you risk everything to save one of them. The argument that followed was conducted partly in Cherokee and partly in English, but its essential character was clear enough. David saw Joseph's rescue of Sarah as proof of divided loyalties, evidence that his mixed heritage had finally tipped him completely into the white world. Joseph tried to explain the circumstances, but each explanation only seemed to deepen David's conviction that his cousin had betrayed fundamental principles of Cherokee loyalty. "Where is she now?" David finally demanded. "The white woman. What have you done with her?" Sarah held her breath, knowing that her life now hung on Joseph's answer. If he revealed her hiding place, David's warriors would drag her out and use her as proof of Joseph's treachery. If he refused to reveal her location, it would seem like evidence of guilt. "She left," Joseph said finally. "When the roads cleared, she went to the white settlement." It was a lie, and from David's skeptical grunt, not a very convincing one. But it was also Sarah's only hope of remaining hidden until she could figure out how to resolve this impossible situation. "You expect me to believe she simply walked away?" David asked. "Through snow that reaches a horse's belly, over mountain trails that challenge even Cherokee warriors. A soft white woman who has probably never walked farther than from her parlor to her garden." "Believe what you choose," Joseph replied with the same careful neutrality Sarah had heard him use with the federal soldiers. "I can only tell you what happened." The conversation continued, but Sarah could tell that David was not convinced by his cousin's explanation. The warriors would be watching Joseph now, waiting for him to make contact with Sarah or to do something else that would prove his guilt. Her presence here, meant to be temporary shelter from a storm, had become a trap that could destroy them both. As darkness fell and the warriors finally departed with threats and warnings, Sarah remained hidden in the root cellar. She could hear Joseph moving around above, cleaning up the damage from David's search, but she dared not emerge until she was certain they were truly alone. When Joseph finally tapped the signal for her to come out, Sarah found him sitting by the fire with a face aged by the day's events. The cabin looked like a battlefield, with broken furniture and scattered possessions marking the warriors' angry search. "I'm sorry," Sarah said quietly. "I've brought nothing but trouble into your life." Joseph looked up at her with eyes that held a mixture of exhaustion and something else, something that might have been gratitude. "You didn't choose to be here any more than I chose to find you. Sometimes trouble finds us whether we seek it or not." But even as he spoke the conciliatory words, Sarah could see the weight of consequence settling on his shoulders. His cousin's visit had marked a point of no return, a moment when neutrality was no longer possible and choices would have to be made. "What will you do?" she asked. Joseph stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. "I don't know. David will be watching me now, waiting for proof of his suspicions. The federal soldiers already suspect me of aiding Cherokee resistance, and you." He looked at her with an expression that mixed concern with something deeper. "You can't stay here, but you can't safely leave either." The impossibility of their situation hung between them like a sword suspended by a thread. They were trapped together by circumstances that made their separation as dangerous as their continued association. Every choice led to peril, every path forward seemed blocked by the prejudices and fears of two communities, determined to see enemies where they might have found allies. Outside, the mountain wind carried the scent of snow and the promise of more storms to come. Inside the damaged cabin, two people who should have been natural enemies found themselves bound together by forces neither could control, facing a future that seemed to offer nothing but tragedy regardless of what choices they made. The revelation came at dawn on the fourth day, brought by Joseph's grandfather figure, Thomas Walking Bear, who arrived alone and on foot through the snow-covered forest. Sarah watched from the window as the elderly Cherokee approached the cabin with the measured pace of a man bearing grave news. Thomas Walking Bear was ancient by any measure, his face mapped with lines that spoke of nearly 70 winters in these mountains. But his eyes were sharp as obsidian chips, and his bearing carried the dignity of a man who had watched the world change around him, while holding fast to truths that transcended the shifting tides of political fortune. Joseph met the elder at the door with the respectful deference due to age and wisdom. Their conversation was conducted entirely in Cherokee, but Sarah could read the increasing tension in Joseph's posture as Thomas spoke. When the old man finally switched to English, his words carried the weight of impending catastrophe. "The sacred grove has been violated," Thomas said, his voice heavy with sorrow and rage. "White soldiers with picks and shovels, digging like dogs after buried bones. They say there is gold beneath the sacred stones, gold that belongs to the Great Father in Washington." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as the implications became clear. The sacred grove Thomas mentioned was clearly a site of religious significance to the Cherokee, but if gold had been discovered there, it would become a target for miners and speculators who recognized no authority higher than profit. "How much do they know?" Joseph asked quietly. "Too much," Thomas replied grimly. "Someone told them where to dig. Someone who knew the old stories about the treasure cave beneath Crying Rock Falls. The soldiers didn't find it by accident." Joseph's face went still with a kind of controlled fury that Sarah had never seen before. "David thinks I'm the one who told them." "David thinks many things, most of them foolish," Thomas said with the dismissive tone of an elder correcting a headstrong youth. "But he is not wrong that someone betrayed the sacred places. Someone with knowledge of Cherokee secrets and access to white authority." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, and Sarah began to understand the true complexity of Joseph's position. His role as a trader between communities had given him knowledge that could be valuable to either side, but it had also made him suspect to both. Now that sacred Cherokee sites were being violated, his mixed heritage and his business relationships would make him the obvious target for suspicion. "There's more," Thomas continued, his eyes finding Sarah's face through the window where she stood watching. "Captain Hayes is organizing search parties. He says a white woman has been taken by Cherokee warriors, and he means to rescue her with fire and sword if necessary." Sarah stepped back from the window, her heart racing with the realization that her disappearance had been discovered and misinterpreted in exactly the way she had feared. Captain Hayes, with his military background and obvious distrust of the Cherokee, would see her missing wagon and Joseph's proximity to the crash site as evidence of kidnapping rather than rescue. "How long before they reach this area?" Joseph asked. 2 days, maybe 3 if the weather slows them," Thomas replied. "But they will come, and they will not be interested in explanations. Hayes has been looking for an excuse to drive all Cherokee from these mountains, and a white woman's disappearance is exactly the justification he needs." Joseph opened the cabin door and gestured for Thomas to enter, his face grim with the weight of impossible choices. As the elder stepped inside, his eyes immediately found Sarah, taking in her presence with the sharp assessment of a man who had survived by reading situations quickly and accurately. "So," Thomas said in English, his voice neutral but his eyes missing nothing, "the white woman who caused all this trouble. Are you worth the blood that will be spilled because of you?" The question was brutal in its directness, but Sarah recognized that Thomas Walking Bear was not being cruel, merely practical. In his world, Individual lives were weighed against the survival of the community, and her presence here threatened far more than just her own reputation. "I didn't ask to be rescued," Sarah replied with as much dignity as she could muster. "But I'm grateful that Joseph chose to save my life, whatever the consequences." Thomas studied her for a long moment, his ancient eyes seeming to peer into her soul. "Grateful enough to die to protect Cherokee secrets? Grateful enough to lie to your own people to prevent a war?" The question struck at the heart of Sarah's dilemma. She was being asked to choose sides in a conflict she had never wanted to join, to make decisions that would affect the lives of people she barely knew. But as she looked at Joseph's face, seeing the strain of years of impossible choices written in every line, she found her answer. "Yes," she said simply, "I am." Thomas nodded slowly, as if her response confirmed something he had suspected. "Then you must understand what we face. The sacred grove is not just a religious site. It guards the entrance to caverns where Cherokee treasures have been hidden for generations, artifacts and gold that represent the accumulated wealth of our people. If the white soldiers find those caves, they will take everything, leaving Cherokee families with nothing to sustain them through the removal." Sarah felt the weight of revelation settle on her shoulders. She was not just an innocent bystander, caught in political crossfire. She was now keeper of secrets that could determine the survival of an entire people. The knowledge made her both valuable and dangerous to everyone involved. "There's something else," Thomas continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that barely carried across the cabin. "Maps. Hidden in the sacred caves are maps showing the locations of other Cherokee refuges throughout these mountains, places where families are hiding from the removal agents. If those maps fall into federal hands, hundreds of Cherokee will be hunted down and forced onto the removal trail." The full scope of the catastrophe became clear to Sarah. This was not just about gold or religious sites. It was about the survival of a people facing systematic extermination. Her rescue, which had seemed like a simple human kindness, had somehow become entangled with the most sensitive secrets of Cherokee resistance. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. Joseph and Thomas exchanged glances, and Sarah could see that they had already discussed possibilities before Thomas's arrival. "Captain Hayes will listen to you," Joseph said finally. "If you return to the settlement and tell him you escaped on your own, that you were never held captive, it might diffuse some of the anger driving his search parties. But it won't stop the excavation of the sacred grove," Sarah pointed out. "If they've already found evidence of gold, they won't abandon the site just because I'm safely returned." Thomas nodded grimly. "No, but it might buy us time to remove the most precious items before they discover the main caves. Every day matters." Now, Sarah understood what they were asking of her. She would have to return to Mill Creek Settlement, face the suspicions and questions that would inevitably follow her mysterious disappearance, and somehow deflect attention from the sacred sites without revealing what she now knew about Cherokee. "Secrets. There's one more thing," Thomas said, his eyes holding hers with uncomfortable intensity. "David Kingfisher has called for a war council. Young warriors from several bands are gathering, and they speak of striking first before the white soldiers can destroy everything sacred to Cherokee people. If this turns into open warfare, many will die on both sides." The threat of bloodshed added urgency to an already desperate situation. Sarah could imagine David's argument to the war council. The sacred sites were being violated. Cherokee families were being hunted down, and negotiation had failed to protect what mattered most. From a Cherokee perspective, violence might seem like the only option left. "How much time do we have?" Joseph asked. "The War Council meets tomorrow night," Thomas replied. "David will argue for immediate action, striking the excavation site and the federal garrison at Mill Creek. Others will counsel patience. But patience is hard to maintain when sacred ground is being desecrated." Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. Her decision about how to handle her return to the settlement could determine whether this conflict escalated into open warfare or found some path toward resolution. "I'll go back," she said finally. "I'll tell them I escaped, that I was never held captive. But I need to know how to contact you if things go wrong." Joseph nodded, but she could see the reluctance in his eyes. Sending her back meant losing whatever protection he could offer, placing her at the mercy of people who might not be interested in hearing explanations that contradicted their assumptions about Cherokee guilt. "There's a trading post at the junction of Mill Creek and the old Cherokee Trail," Joseph said. "Caldwell knows how to get messages to me if necessary. But once you return to the settlement, any contact between us will be dangerous for both of us." Thomas Walking Bear rose to leave, his mission accomplished but his face grave with the knowledge of what was coming. Before departing, he turned to Sarah with an expression that mixed respect with warning. "You have chosen to help Cherokee people when you had no obligation to do so," he said formally. "That choice will be remembered, but it will also mark you as an enemy to some of your own people. Be very careful who you trust with what you now know." After Thomas left, Sarah and Joseph spent their remaining time together preparing for a separation that both knew might be permanent. The clothes she had borrowed would have to be abandoned, as they would raise questions she couldn't answer. Her story would have to be carefully constructed to explain her survival without implicating Joseph or revealing anything about Cherokee secrets. "There's something I need to give you," Joseph said as evening approached. From a hidden compartment in the cabin wall, he produced a small leather pouch containing what appeared to be Cherokee jewelry and a folded paper covered with Cherokee syllabary. "If the worst happens," he said quietly, "if the War Council chooses violence and federal troops begin killing Cherokee families indiscriminately, take these to any Cherokee elder and tell them you were sent by Kanuna. They'll know you speak with my authority." Sarah accepted the pouch, understanding that she was being entrusted with items that could provide safe passage through Cherokee territory if the mountains erupted into warfare. The weight of the responsibility was almost overwhelming, but she recognized that Joseph was trying to protect her, even as she prepared to leave his protection. As they shared their final meal together, Sarah found herself studying Joseph's face, memorizing the details she might never see again. The strong jaw, the amber eyes that could hold such warmth, despite the wariness life had taught him, the careful way he moved that spoke of constant alertness to danger. "I want you to know," she said quietly, "that these have been the most honest days of my life. Whatever happens next, I'm grateful for that." Joseph met her gaze across the small table, and for a moment the careful barriers he maintained seemed to drop away entirely. "I've spent years learning to trust no one completely," he said. "You've reminded me what that costs." Outside, the wind was rising again, promising another storm that would make travel difficult but would also provide cover for Sarah's journey back to Mill Creek settlement. They would leave separately in the morning, Joseph returning to his people to try to prevent a war, Sarah returning to hers to try to prevent a massacre. Neither spoke of the possibility that they might never see each other again, but the knowledge hung between them like the mountain mist that clung to the peaks outside the cabin. The journey back to Mill Creek settlement became a nightmare of deception and desperate improvisation. Sarah had departed Joseph's cabin before dawn, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and a story she prayed would hold under scrutiny. The leather pouch containing Cherokee artifacts was sewn into the lining of her coat, a hidden weight that reminded her with every step of the secrets she now carried. She had made it only halfway down the mountain trail when she encountered the first search party. Captain Hayes led the group personally, his weathered face grim with determination and barely controlled fury. Behind him rode 6 men from the settlement, all armed and clearly prepared for violence. "Miss Morrison," Hayes called out as she emerged from a grove of snow-laden pines, her appearance designed to suggest a woman who had been struggling through the wilderness for days, Thank God you're alive. We feared the worst when we found your wagon." Sarah forced herself to stumble slightly, as if exhausted by her ordeal. "Captain Hayes," she gasped, allowing relief to color her voice. "I thought I might never see another Christian soul." Hayes dismounted immediately, his military bearing softening with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Where have you been?" "We've been searching for 3 days. The Cherokee in these mountains, did they harm you in any way?" The question carried undertones that made Sarah's skin crawl, implications that spoke to the deepest fears and prejudices of the frontier community. She understood that her answer would determine not just her own fate, but possibly the fate of every Cherokee family in the region. "I was never captured," she said firmly, meeting Hayes's eyes directly. "When the wagon crashed, I managed to crawl free before the cold could take me. I found shelter in a cave further up the mountain, survived on snow and what little food had been thrown from the wagon." Dr. Webb, who had ridden with the search party, moved forward to examine her condition. His professional assessment was thorough but gentle, and Sarah was grateful for the medical knowledge that allowed her to present symptoms consistent with exposure and minor injuries without revealing the more serious wounds that Joseph had treated. "You're fortunate to be alive," Webb said quietly. "Few people could survive alone in these mountains during a blizzard." "Divine providence," Sarah replied, the phrase carrying just enough religious conviction to satisfy the expectations of her rescuers while avoiding outright lies about the source of her salvation. As the search party prepared to escort her back to the settlement, Sarah caught Hayes studying her with the sharp eyes of a man accustomed to evaluating both enemies and subordinates. Something in his expression suggested that her explanation, while accepted, had not entirely satisfied his suspicions. "Strange thing," Hayes mused as they began the descent toward Mill Creek. "We found Cherokee tracks near your wagon, recent ones. Made us think they might have taken you, or at least investigated the crash site." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. "I saw riders in the distance once or twice, but they never came close to where I was hiding. Perhaps they were afraid of being blamed for the accident." It was a plausible explanation, one that played to Hayes's preconceptions about Cherokee. Guilt and fear of white authority. But Sarah could see that the captain was still processing information, still trying to construct a narrative that explained all the evidence his men had found. The settlement welcomed Sarah's return with a mixture of relief and curiosity that she found almost as challenging as Hayes's suspicions. Dr. Webb insisted on a thorough medical examination, while the settlement's women flocked around her with questions about her ordeal and offers of clothing to replace her travel-stained garments. Sarah navigated these interactions with careful precision, maintaining her story while deflecting the more probing questions with appropriate displays of trauma and exhaustion. She was particularly careful around Mrs. Hayes, the captain's wife, whose sharp intelligence and protective instincts toward the community made her a potentially dangerous interrogator. "You must have been terrified," Mrs. Hayes said over the dinner table that first evening, her voice warm with sympathy, but her eyes alert for inconsistencies. "A woman alone in those mountains, with Cherokee warriors roaming about. How did you manage to avoid them for so long?" "I stayed hidden during the day and moved only at night," Sarah replied, which was partially true if one considered her concealment in Joseph's root cellar. "The cave I found was well concealed, and I was careful to leave no tracks in the snow." The conversation continued through the meal, with various settlement members contributing their own theories about Sarah's survival and their opinions about Cherokee behavior in general. Sarah listened with growing discomfort to the casual hatred and fear that colored every reference to the native population, understanding now why Joseph had learned to hide his true thoughts behind masks of utility and compliance. It was after dinner, when Captain Hayes drew her aside for a private conversation, that Sarah faced her most dangerous moment. The captain's study was a Spartan room that reflected his military background, with maps of the region covering most of one wall and a collection of weapons displayed with martial precision. "Miss Morrison," Has began, his tone deceptively casual, "I want you to know that your safety is my primary concern. But I also have responsibilities to this entire community, and recent events have me concerned about Cherokee activities in these mountains." Sarah waited, recognizing the preamble to more serious questioning. "We've had reports of unusual Cherokee movements lately," Hayes continued, moving to stand beside the regional map. "Increased activity around certain areas that have always been considered sensitive. Combined with your disappearance and the discovery of your wagon near Cherokee territory, it paints a picture that troubles me. I understand your concerns," Sarah said carefully, "but I can only tell you what I experienced. I saw Cherokee riders, but they kept their distance. I never felt directly threatened by them." Hayes nodded, but his attention had shifted to the map, specifically to an area marked with red ink that Sarah realized must indicate the location of the sacred grove Thomas Walking Bear had mentioned. "There's something else," Hayes said, turning back to face her. "Federal surveyors have made some interesting discoveries in Cherokee territory. Geological formations that suggest mineral deposits of significant value. Gold, to be specific." Sarah felt her blood turn cold, but she managed to keep her expression appropriately puzzled. "I'm afraid I don't understand how that relates to my experience, Captain." "Perhaps it doesn't," Hayes replied, but his eyes remained sharp with calculation. "But timing is curious, isn't it? Cherokee resistance to removal has intensified, just as we discover that their land contains resources that could benefit the entire nation. Makes a man wonder if they know more about those deposits than they're letting on." The conversation was moving into territory that Sarah recognized as extremely dangerous. Hayes was clearly building toward some kind of action against Cherokee interests, using her disappearance and rescue as part of a larger justification for aggressive measures. "I hope you're not suggesting that my accident was somehow connected to Cherokee mining activities," Sarah said with what she hoped was appropriate bewilderment. "That seems rather far-fetched." "Perhaps," Hayes agreed, but his tone suggested otherwise. "Still, I think it would be wise to increase security around certain areas of interest. Federal troops will be conducting extended patrols, and I've advised all settlement members to avoid traveling alone in Cherokee territory." Sarah understood that she was being warned away from any future contact with Cherokee communities, while also being informed that military pressure on those communities was about to intensify dramatically. Her return had not diffused the situation as she had hoped. Instead, it seemed to have provided Hayes with additional justification for the very actions she had hoped to prevent. That night, alone in the small room Dr. Webb had provided for her use, Sarah wrestled with the implications of her situation. Her escape story had been accepted, but it had not achieved its intended purpose of reducing tensions between the communities. If anything, Hayes seemed more convinced than ever that Cherokee resistance was connected to the gold discoveries, and more determined to crush that resistance before it could interfere with federal mining interests. The weight of the Cherokee artifacts hidden in her coat seemed to grow heavier as she contemplated her next moves. Joseph had trusted her with items that could provide safe passage through Cherokee territory, but using them would require her to maintain contact with Cherokee communities despite Hayes's warnings. The risk was enormous, but the alternative might be watching helplessly as the situation escalated into the open warfare that Thomas Walking Bear had predicted. Sarah's contemplation was interrupted by a soft knock at her door. Dr. Webb entered. At her invitation, carrying a medical bag and wearing an expression of professional concern mixed with something else, something that might have been suspicion. "I wanted to check your injuries once more," Webb said, setting his bag on the small table beside her bed. "Some of the trauma patterns seem inconsistent with the survival story you've described." Sarah's heart began to race, but she submitted to the examination with what she hoped was appropriate patient compliance. Webb's hands were gentle but thorough as he checked the healing wound on her forehead and examined the bruising on her ribs and legs. "These injuries," Webb said quietly, "they show signs of professional treatment. Clean stitching, proper bandaging. Techniques, application of herbal medicines that accelerated healing. Not the kind of care one provides for oneself while hiding in a cave." The doctor's words hung in the air between them like an accusation, though his tone remained carefully neutral. Sarah understood that she was facing a moment of truth that could determine not just her own fate, but the fate of everyone whose lives had become entangled with her rescue. "Someone helped you," Webb continued, his intelligent eyes searching her face. "Someone with medical knowledge and access to proper supplies. The question is whether that someone was friend or captor, and whether admitting their assistance would place them in danger." Sarah met the doctor's gaze directly, recognizing in his expression the same moral complexity that had characterized her entire experience in these mountains. Webb was clearly a man of principle, but he was also a member of a community that had strong opinions about Cherokee character and Cherokee threats. "Dr. Webb," she said carefully, "if someone had helped me, someone whose assistance might be misunderstood by others, what would your professional obligations require you to do with that information?" The question was a test, and both of them knew it. Webb's response would determine whether Sarah could trust him with the truth, or whether she would have to maintain her deception despite the medical evidence that contradicted it. Webb sat down heavily in the room's single chair, his medical bag forgotten as he considered the implications of her question. "My primary obligation is to my patients," he said finally. "But I also have responsibilities to this community and to the truth. Sometimes those obligations conflict." "And when they do?" Sarah prompted. "When they do," Webb replied with obvious reluctance, "I try to choose the course that does the least harm to innocent people, regardless of their race or their political allegiances." Sarah heard in his words an opening, a possibility that she might find an ally in the most unexpected place. Dr. Webb's medical training had given him a perspective on human suffering that transcended the racial prejudices of his community, and his professional ethics might provide protection for secrets that could save lives. "Suppose," Sarah said carefully, "that someone had indeed helped me. Suppose that person was Cherokee, but that their assistance was given freely, with no coercion or improper conduct. Suppose further that revealing this assistance might endanger not just that person, but their entire family and community. What would you advise?" Webb considered her hypothetical question with the serious attention it deserved. "I would advise caution," he said finally. "And I would remind you that sometimes the most important truths are also the most dangerous ones. But I would also say that a person's character is revealed not by their race or their political loyalties, but by their actions when faced with the suffering of others." Sarah felt a surge of hope that perhaps she had found someone who might understand the complexity of her situation. And if that person's actions had been consistently honorable, despite the political tensions surrounding them, then I would say that such a person deserved protection from those who might misinterpret their motives. Webb replied, his meaning clear despite the careful indirection of their conversation. The alliance that formed between them in that moment was fragile and unspoken, but it provided Sarah with something she had desperately needed, a connection to someone within the settlement who might help her navigate the dangerous waters ahead. Webb's medical authority gave him influence with Captain Hayes, and his ethical principles might provide a counterweight to the captain's military pragmatism. As Webb prepared to leave, he paused at the door with one final observation. "Miss Morrison, I want you to know that whatever happened during your disappearance, I believe you acted with courage and integrity. I hope you'll continue to do so, regardless of the pressures you may face." After he left, Sarah lay awake late into the night, listening to the sounds of the settlement around her and thinking about the impossible position she now occupied. She was trusted by neither community, but essential to both, carrying secrets that could save lives or start wars depending on how they were revealed. Outside her window, the mountain peaks stood silent against the star-filled sky, holding their own secrets in the darkness. Somewhere in those peaks, Joseph was probably lying awake as well, wondering whether her return had achieved its intended purpose or merely provided their enemies with new ammunition for the conflict that seemed increasingly inevitable. The Cherokee. Artifacts hidden in her coat seemed to pulse with their own weight, a reminder that she now carried the hopes and fears of people she had barely met, but whose fate had become inextricably linked with her own choices. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for mistake or betrayal, new chances to either prevent a war or accidentally trigger one. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to find sleep, knowing that she would need all her strength for the battles ahead. In the morning, she would have to begin the delicate work of building bridges between communities that seemed determined to see only enemies where they might have found allies. The success or failure of that effort might determine whether the mountain peaks would witness the dawn of peace or the sunset of an entire people's freedom. The crisis came 3 days later with the thunder of hoofbeats and the sharp crack of rifle fire echoing through the mountain valleys. Sarah was teaching her first class of settler children when the commotion erupted, young voices raised in alarm as riders approached the settlement at breakneck speed. Through the schoolhouse window, Sarah watched as David Kingfisher and a band of Cherokee warriors swept down from the ridge trail, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces painted for war. But these were not raiders coming to attack the settlement. They were messengers bringing news that would shatter any remaining hope for peaceful resolution. Captain Hayes emerged from his headquarters with his rifle already in hand, shouting orders to the settlement's men as they scrambled to defensive positions. The children in Sarah's classroom pressed against the windows, their eyes wide with excitement and fear as they witnessed their first glimpse of the Cherokee warriors their parents had taught them to fear. "Stay away from the windows," Sarah instructed firmly, though her own heart was racing with the implications of David's dramatic arrival. Cherokee warriors did not approach white settlements openly unless the situation had become desperate beyond all normal calculation. David Kingfisher rode directly to the center of the settlement's main square, his war paint and weapons making it clear that he came not as a supplicant, but as an equal demanding to be heard. When he spoke, his voice carried across the settlement with the authority of justified rage. "White Captain," David called to Hayes, his English heavily accented but perfectly clear, "your soldiers have spilled Cherokee blood on sacred ground. Cherokee children lie dead beside Crying Rock Falls, their bodies defiled by your diggers and your greed." The accusation hit the settlement like a physical blow. Sarah felt her knees go weak as she understood that the worst possible scenario had unfolded at the sacred grove. Federal troops, searching for gold beneath the ceremonial grounds, had encountered Cherokee families and opened fire. Hayes stepped forward with his rifle raised but not quite aimed, his military training warring with political calculation. "I don't know what you're talking about, Cherokee. Federal troops are conducting legitimate surveys on government land. If your people interfered with lawful activities, they brought whatever consequences on themselves. Lawful?" David's voice rose to a shout that echoed off the surrounding mountains. "You call the murder of children lawful? You call the desecration of graves where Cherokee ancestors sleep lawful? You call the theft of gold that has rested beneath sacred stones for 1,000 years lawful?" Sarah understood that David had come not to negotiate, but to deliver an ultimatum, and the gathered settlers were beginning to understand it too. Women hurried their children indoors while men checked their weapons, all of them recognizing that they stood at the precipice of open warfare. "The Cherokee Council has spoken," David continued, his words carrying the weight of formal declaration. "White soldiers have 3 days to withdraw from all Cherokee sacred lands. White diggers have 3 days to fill their holes and leave Cherokee gold in Cherokee ground. If this is not done, Cherokee warriors will drive them out with fire and death. Hayes raised his rifle to his shoulder, the movement deliberate and threatening. Get off my land, Cherokee, before I have you shot for threatening federal officers. Wait, she called out desperately, stepping between the two groups despite the obvious danger. David, before you make this choice, there's something you should know about someone who shares your concerns about Cherokee sacred sites. David's eyes fixed on her with sudden sharp attention, and Sarah realized she was about to cross a line that would expose her connection to Joseph and everything that had happened during her disappearance. But with weapons drawn and violence imminent, protecting her own secrets seemed less important than preventing a massacre. There's a Cherokee man who risked his life to save mine, Sarah continued, her voice carrying clearly across the tense square. A man who lives between Cherokee and white worlds, who has tried to prevent exactly this kind of confrontation. If you respect his judgment, perhaps you'll give peace one more chance. She reached into her coat and withdrew the leather pouch Joseph had given her, holding it high enough for David to see the Cherokee symbols worked into the leather. The effect on the Cherokee warrior was immediate and dramatic, his eyes widening with recognition as he lowered his rifle slightly. Kanuna, David whispered, using Joseph's Cherokee name with obvious respect. You carry the mark of Kanuna. Sarah felt the weight of every eye in the settlement as she stood in the open square, holding Cherokee artifacts that proved her connection to people Hayes had already identified as enemies. But there was no retreat now, no way to unsay words that had committed her to a course of action that would brand her as either peacemaker or traitor, depending on its outcome. Yes, she said simply. And he asked me to use these if Cherokee people were in danger of making choices that could destroy them. David Kingfisher, your courage honors your people, but your death in this square today would not bring back the children who were killed at Crying Rock Falls. The appeal struck home because it came not from a white authority figure, but from someone who carried proof of Cherokee trust. David studied the artifacts in Sarah's hands, recognizing their significance and the risk she was taking by revealing them publicly. 3 days, David said finally, lowering his rifle completely. Cherokee warriors will wait 3 days for white soldiers to leave Cherokee sacred ground. After that, Cherokee blood will have Cherokee vengeance. With that ultimatum delivered, David wheeled his horse around and led his warriors back toward the mountain trails, leaving the settlement in stunned silence. Sarah stood alone in the square, still holding the Cherokee pouch that had potentially prevented immediate bloodshed, but had certainly identified her as someone with dangerous sympathies. Hayes approached her with an expression of cold fury, his rifle still in his hands and his military bearing radiating barely controlled anger. Miss Morrison, he said in a voice that could have frozen the mountain streams, I think you and I need to have a very serious conversation about your loyalties and your recent experiences. Sarah understood that her intervention had bought time for a peaceful resolution, but it had also cost her any hope of maintaining her position within the settlement. Hayes now knew that she had lied about her rescue, that she had connections to Cherokee resistance, and that she possessed items that proved ongoing contact with people he considered enemies of federal authority. As the captain escorted her toward his headquarters, Sarah caught sight of Dr. Webb watching from the doorway of his medical office. The doctor's expression mixed concern with something that might have been approval, suggesting that she might still have at least one ally within the settlement's leadership. But as Sarah walked toward what she knew would be a confrontation that could result in her arrest or worse, she found herself thinking not of her own fate but of Joseph Ridge Walker, somewhere in the mountains trying to prevent the very war that her dramatic intervention might have made inevitable. In 3 days, Cherokee warriors would either see federal troops withdraw from sacred sites, or they would begin a conflict that could only end in tragedy for everyone involved. The leather pouch felt heavy in her hands as she considered the impossible position she now occupied. Trusted by neither side, but essential to both, carrying secrets that could save lives or destroy them depending on the choices she made in the next 72 hours. Behind her, the mountain peaks stood silent and watchful, holding their breath for what was to come. The interrogation lasted through the night and into the following morning, with Captain Hayes methodically dismantling every aspect of Sarah's carefully constructed story. The captain's military intelligence training served him well as he identified contradictions, pressed for details, and gradually constructed a narrative that placed Sarah at the center of what he now viewed as a Cherokee conspiracy against federal authority. "You were never alone in any cave," Hayes stated with flat certainty as dawn light filtered through the windows of his headquarters. "Someone provided medical treatment for your injuries. Someone with considerable skill and access to supplies that aren't available in Cherokee camps. That someone was Joseph Ridge Walker, wasn't it?" Sarah had maintained her original story for hours, but exhaustion and the weight of evidence had finally broken down her resistance. The Cherokee artifacts, her knowledge of David Kingfisher's true name, her obvious familiarity with Cherokee concerns about sacred sites, all pointed to connections that couldn't be explained by her original account of solitary survival. "Yes," she admitted finally, the word coming out as barely more than a whisper. "Joseph Ridge Walker saved my life when my wagon crashed. I would have died without his help." Hayes leaned back in his chair with the satisfaction of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey. "And during the time you spent in his cabin, what did he tell you about Cherokee plans for resistance to federal removal policies?" "Nothing," Sarah replied with more strength, recognizing that this question struck at the heart of Hayes's real concerns. "He never discussed politics with me. He was simply a man who couldn't let another human being freeze to death in a storm." "I find that difficult to believe," Hayes said coldly. "Ridge Walker is known to us as a traitor who moves between Cherokee and white communities, someone who would have access to information valuable to both sides. You expect me to believe he rescued a white woman without attempting to use her for intelligence purposes?" The question revealed the fundamental inability of men like Hayes to understand actions motivated by simple human decency rather than political calculation. To the captain, every relationship was transactional. Every kindness was ultimately self-interested, and the idea that a Cherokee man might risk his life for a white woman without expecting something in return was incomprehensible. "That's exactly what I expect you to believe," Sarah said firmly, "because that's exactly what happened. Joseph Ridge Walker is a man of honor who helped me because I needed help, not because he hoped to gain anything from me." Hayes studied her face with the careful attention of an experienced interrogator, looking for signs of deception or hidden knowledge. What he saw there seemed to both frustrate and intrigue him, as if Sarah's obvious sincerity complicated narratives he had already constructed about Cherokee treachery and white victimhood. "Miss Morrison," Hayes said finally, his tone shifting from accusatory to almost paternal, "I believe you're telling me what you think is the truth. But I also believe you've been manipulated by people whose ultimate goals you don't understand. Ridge Walker may have saved your life, but that doesn't mean his motives were purely altruistic." Sarah felt a surge of anger at the suggestion that her judgment was so poor she couldn't recognize manipulation when she experienced it. "Captain Hayes, I spent 4 days in close quarters with Joseph Ridge Walker. I observed his character under circumstances that reveal a person's true nature. He is not the conniving savage your prejudices require him to be." The challenge to his racial assumptions clearly struck home, but Hayes's response revealed the depth of his commitment to maintaining those assumptions despite contradictory evidence. "Miss Morrison, you're an educated woman from Philadelphia. You have no experience with the realities of frontier life or the true nature of Indian character. What you interpret as nobility might simply be cunning patience, and what you interpret as cunning might simply be dignity under impossible circumstances," Sarah replied, recognizing that she was arguing not just about Joseph's character, but about fundamental questions of human nature and racial prejudice. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside Hayes's headquarters, raised voices and the sound of multiple horses arriving at speed. Through the window, Sarah could see Dr. Webb in animated conversation with several men she didn't recognize their clothing and bearing, suggesting they were federal officials of some rank. Hayes rose to investigate, leaving Sarah alone for the first time since her interrogation had begun. She used the brief respite to consider her situation and the limited options remaining to her. Hayes clearly intended to use her connection to Joseph as evidence of a larger Cherokee conspiracy, while the 3-day ultimatum from David Kingfisher created a ticking clock that would soon explode into violence regardless of what she revealed or concealed. When Hayes returned, he was accompanied by a thin man in an expensive suit whose pale complexion and soft hands marked him as someone more familiar with Washington offices than mountain warfare. The newcomer studied Sarah with the dispassionate interest of an entomologist examining an interesting specimen. "Miss Morrison," Hayes said formally, "this is Agent Crawford from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He's here to investigate reports of Cherokee resistance activity in this region, and he's very interested in your recent experiences." Crawford settled into a chair across from Sarah, with the unhurried movements of a man accustomed to extracting information from reluctant sources. His approach was markedly different from Hayes's military directness, more subtle and conversational, but somehow more threatening for its apparent reasonableness. "Miss Morrison," Crawford began with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I understand you've had quite an adventure in our beautiful mountains. I'm hoping you can help me understand some aspects of Cherokee activity that have been brought to my attention." Sarah recognized that she was now facing a different kind of interrogation, one conducted by someone with the authority to make her cooperation a matter of federal rather than merely local concern. Crawford's presence meant that her situation had escalated beyond a simple frontier dispute into something that Washington considered worthy of direct attention. "I'm not sure how much help I can be," Sarah replied carefully. "My experience was limited to being rescued by one man who showed me kindness when I needed it most." "Ah yes, Joseph Ridgewalker," Crawford said, consulting a leather folder that apparently contained considerable information about Joseph's activities. "Quite an interesting individual. Half Cherokee, half white, educated in both traditions, and apparently trusted by both communities despite the current tensions." The casual mention of Joseph's mixed heritage and his complex position between communities suggested that Crawford knew far more about the local situation than his recent arrival might indicate. Sarah realized she was dealing with someone who had been planning this investigation for some time, gathering intelligence and preparing strategies well before the recent crisis at Crying Rock Falls. "Mr. Ridgewalker has been on our list of persons of interest for several months," Crawford continued conversationally. "His trading activities have given him access to information from both Cherokee and white communities, and we've been curious about how he's been using that access." Sarah felt a chill of premonition as she understood that Joseph had been under federal surveillance long before her rescue, that his careful neutrality had not protected him from official suspicion. Her connection to him revealed by her intervention during David Kingfisher's ultimatum had simply provided Crawford with an opportunity to investigate someone already considered potentially dangerous. "Joseph Ridgewalker is a man trying to survive in an impossible situation," Sarah said with quiet dignity. "He's done nothing wrong except show kindness to someone who needed help." Crawford's smile widened slightly as if her defense of Joseph confirmed suspicions he had already formed. "Miss Morrison, I appreciate your loyalty to someone who helped you, but I need you to understand the larger context of what's happening in these mountains." The agent opened his folder and withdrew several documents that he spread across the table between them. Sarah could see maps, correspondence, and what appeared to be intelligence reports, all marked with official seals and stamps that spoke to the federal government's serious interest in Cherokee affairs. Over the past 6 months, Crawford explained, we've documented increasing Cherokee resistance to removal policies, secret meetings, weapons acquisitions, coordination between different Cherokee bands that should have been relocated months ago. Someone has been organizing this resistance, and that someone has been very careful to avoid direct confrontation with federal authority. Sarah studied the documents, recognizing some of the locations marked on the maps but understanding that her knowledge of Cherokee sacred sites now made her a valuable intelligence asset in Crawford's investigation. The explosion came at dawn on the 3rd day, not from Cherokee weapons, but from the federal mining operation at Crying Rock Falls. Agent Crawford had decided that the ultimatum deadline was an opportunity rather than a threat, ordering his men to accelerate their excavation of the sacred grove with dynamite and heavy machinery. The sound rolled across the mountain valleys like thunder, waking every living thing for miles and announcing that negotiations had ended. Sarah stood at the window of her locked room in Hayes's headquarters, watching smoke rise from the direction of the Cherokee sacred sites. Crawford had confined her there after their interrogation, claiming she was under federal protection while he considered whether to charge her with conspiracy or use her as an unwitting intelligence asset. The irony was not lost on her that she was being held prisoner for her own safety by the very people whose actions were about to trigger the bloodshed she had tried to prevent. The first Cherokee attack came within hours of the explosion, swift and precise strikes against the federal excavation sites that demonstrated sophisticated planning and intimate knowledge of federal operations. David Kingfisher had clearly been preparing for this possibility, positioning his warriors where they could inflict maximum damage while minimizing their own exposure to federal retaliation. Hayes burst into Sarah's room without ceremony, his face grim with the realization that his comfortable frontier settlement had become the center of a shooting war. They've hit 3 sites simultaneously, he reported tersely. Destroyed the mining equipment, killed a dozen federal workers, and vanished back into the mountains like ghosts. Sarah felt sick with the knowledge that her intervention had failed to prevent exactly the kind of tragedy she had hoped to avoid. Cherokee warriors were dead, federal soldiers were dead, and the cycle of violence had begun that would inevitably consume innocent people on both sides. "Where is Agent Crawford?" she asked, recognizing that the federal agent's decisions would determine how quickly this conflict escalated into a full-scale war. "Organizing search parties," Hayes replied grimly. "He's convinced that Ridge Walker is coordinating Cherokee resistance from some hidden base in the mountains, and he wants you to help identify possible locations." The demand was exactly what Sarah had feared, an attempt to use her knowledge of Cherokee territory to hunt down the very people who had shown her kindness. The leather pouch with Joseph's artifacts had been confiscated during her interrogation, but Crawford clearly believed she possessed additional information that could be valuable to federal operations. "I won't help you hunt down innocent people," Sarah said with quiet firmness. Hayes studied her face with an expression that mixed frustration with something that might have been respect. "Miss Morrison, I need you to understand that this is no longer about individual sympathies or personal loyalties. Cherokee warriors have killed federal employees and destroyed government property. This is now a military operation, and civilian opinions are no longer relevant." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of gunfire erupted from the settlement's perimeter, accompanied by the distinctive war cries of Cherokee warriors. David Kingfisher's forces had moved beyond hit-and-run tactics against isolated federal sites to direct assault on the settlement itself, bringing the war to the heart of white authority in the region. Hayes grabbed his rifle and rushed toward the sound of combat, leaving Sarah alone but still locked in her room. Through the window, she could see muzzle flashes and smoke as Cherokee warriors engaged federal troops and settlement defenders in running battles between the buildings. The carefully planned attack was designed to create maximum chaos while targeting specific strategic objectives. The battle raged for nearly an hour before the Cherokee forces withdrew, leaving behind burning buildings and casualty reports that would transform this frontier conflict into a national scandal. But Sarah could see that the attack had achieved its primary objective, proving that Cherokee resistance was both organized and capable of striking at targets the federal government considered secure. In the aftermath of the attack, Agent Crawford appeared at Sarah's door with an expression of cold determination that made her blood run cold. The federal agent's carefully maintained facade of reasonableness had been stripped away by Cherokee. Success revealing the ruthless pragmatist beneath. "Miss Morrison," Crawford said without preamble, "the situation has changed dramatically. Cherokee resistance is far more sophisticated than we initially believed, and we need every advantage we can obtain to protect federal personnel and civilian settlements." Sarah recognized the preamble to another attempt to extract information. She was determined not to provide. "I've told you everything I know about my rescue. I have no information about Cherokee military operations." Crawford entered the room and closed the door behind him, his movements deliberate and threatening. Despite his civilian appearance, perhaps not directly, but you've spent time in Cherokee territory, you've observed Cherokee customs and practices, and you've had extensive contact with Joseph Ridge Walker, who we now believe is one of the primary coordinators of Cherokee resistance. The accusation against Joseph hit Sarah like a physical blow, not because she believed it, but because she understood its implications. If Crawford had decided that Joseph was a military target, then her connection to him made her either a valuable intelligence asset or a dangerous security risk. "Joseph Ridge Walker is not a military leader," Sarah protested. "He's a traitor who tries to maintain neutrality between hostile communities. If he's involved in Cherokee resistance, it's only because your policies have made neutrality impossible." Crawford's response revealed the depth of federal determination to crush Cherokee resistance regardless of its motivations or methods. "Miss Morrison, we've intercepted Cherokee communications that reference Kanuna as a key figure in coordinating resistance activities. Kanuna is Ridge Walker's Cherokee name, and the timing of these communications corresponds with periods when he was supposedly conducting innocent trading activities." Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized that Joseph's careful attempts to maintain neutrality had been interpreted as evidence of espionage activity. His knowledge of both communities, his access to federal and Cherokee territory, his ability to move between hostile forces without arousing immediate suspicion, all made him the perfect suspect for coordination of Cherokee resistance. "Even if that were true," Sarah said desperately, "it wouldn't justify the methods you're using. Dynamiting sacred sites, killing Cherokee children, destroying everything that matters to Cherokee culture. You're not fighting military resistance. You're committing cultural genocide." Crawford's response demonstrated the federal government's commitment to policies that brooked no compromise with Cherokee sovereignty. "Miss Morrison, the Cherokee have been given every opportunity to relocate peacefully to designated territories in the West. Their refusal to comply with federal law, their resort to armed resistance, their attacks on federal personnel, all justify whatever methods are necessary to restore order and protect American citizens." The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Webb's arrival, the physician entering without invitation despite Crawford's obvious displeasure. Webb carried his medical bag and wore an expression of professional concern that barely concealed deeper anger. "Agent Crawford," Webb said formally, "I need to speak with Miss Morrison about medical matters related to her recent ordeal. I trust you won't object to a brief consultation with my patient." Crawford clearly wanted to refuse, but Webb's medical authority and his standing within the settlement made direct confrontation inadvisable. "5 minutes, doctor. We have pressing security matters to discuss with Miss Morrison." After Crawford left, Webb quickly examined Sarah's condition while speaking in low, urgent tones that revealed the true purpose of his visit. "Sarah, I don't have much time, so listen carefully. I've been treating Cherokee casualties since this conflict began, and what I've seen convinces me that federal forces are using excessive violence against civilian populations." Sarah felt a surge of hope that she might have found an ally with both moral authority and practical influence. "Dr. Webb, you have to understand that Joseph Ridge Walker is not the military leader Crawford believes him to be. He's being used as a scapegoat for Cherokee resistance that exists because of federal policies, not because of individual agitation." Webb nodded grimly, his medical experience having given him insights into the human cost of the conflict that military leaders preferred to ignore. "I believe you, but Crawford has already decided that Ridge Walker is guilty, and he's planning to use you as bait to draw him into a trap." The revelation chilled Sarah to the bone as she understood the full implications of her captivity. Crawford wasn't holding her as a prisoner or even as an intelligence asset. He was keeping her as live bait to lure Joseph into a confrontation that would result in his capture or death. "There's more," Webb continued urgently. "Federal reinforcements are arriving tomorrow, regular Army troops with orders to end Cherokee resistance permanently. Crawford has convinced his superiors that Cherokee resistance represents a threat to federal authority throughout the Indian Territories, and they're prepared to use whatever force is necessary to eliminate that threat." Sarah understood that the conflict was about to escalate far beyond the local dispute between Cherokee families and federal mining operations. Crawford had successfully portrayed Cherokee resistance as a test of federal resolve that would determine whether other native populations would attempt similar resistance to removal policies. "Is there any way to get word to Joseph?" Sarah asked desperately. "To warn him that he's walking into a trap?" Webb's expression suggested that he had already considered this possibility. "There might be. I have Cherokee patients who trust me, people who might be willing to carry messages if they believed it would save lives rather than endanger them." The plan that emerged from their hurried conversation was dangerous for everyone involved, but it represented the only hope of preventing the complete disaster that Crawford's trap would create. Webb would use his medical practice to make contact with Cherokee families, while Sarah would attempt to provide information that might help Joseph avoid capture while still preventing the escalation of violence. Their planning was interrupted by Crawford's return, the federal agent clearly suspicious of the extended medical consultation. "Doctor, I trust Miss Morrison's health concerns have been adequately addressed. We have security matters that require her immediate attention." Webb gathered his medical supplies with the unhurried movements of a man accustomed to working under pressure. "Of course, Agent Crawford. Miss Morrison appears to be recovering well from her ordeal, though I would recommend against subjecting her to excessive stress in her current condition." After Webb left, Crawford resumed his interrogation with renewed intensity, clearly determined to extract information that would support his planned trap for Joseph. But Sarah had made her choice, and no amount of federal pressure would convince her to betray the man who had saved her life at considerable risk to his own. "Agent Crawford," she said with quiet dignity, "I understand that you believe Joseph Ridge Walker is coordinating Cherokee resistance. But I also understand that your evidence is largely circumstantial, based on coincidences and assumptions, rather than direct observation of criminal activity." Crawford's response revealed the federal government's willingness to act on suspicion, rather than proof when dealing with native populations. "Miss Morrison, in matters of national security, we cannot afford to wait for absolute proof before taking action. The risk to federal personnel and civilian populations is too great to ignore." The conversation continued through the morning and to the afternoon, with Crawford alternating between threats and promises as he tried to secure Sarah's cooperation. But her resolve had been strengthened by Webb's revelations about federal reinforcements and the planned escalation of violence against Cherokee communities. As evening approached, the sound of distant gunfire announced that Cherokee warriors were continuing their attacks on federal positions throughout the mountain region. David Kingfisher's forces had apparently decided that their initial success warranted expanded operations, striking at targets that had previously been considered too well defended to attack. Crawford's frustration with Sarah's refusal to cooperate finally boiled over into the kind of direct threat that revealed his true character beneath the facade of federal authority. "Miss Morrison, I want you to understand that your continued obstruction of this investigation could be interpreted as treason against the United States government. That charge carries serious penalties, including imprisonment or even execution." Sarah met his gaze directly, recognizing that she had reached a point where compromise was no longer possible. "Agent Crawford, I want you to understand that I would rather face whatever penalties you threaten than live with the knowledge that I helped you murder innocent people whose only crime was refusing to abandon their ancestral homeland." The standoff was interrupted by urgent knocking at the door, and Hayes entered with news that would transform the entire character of the conflict. "Agent Crawford, we've received word from Cherokee sources that they're holding federal personnel as prisoners, including some of the mining engineers from Crying Rock Falls. They're demanding negotiations for prisoner exchange." Crawford's immediate response revealed his priorities and his understanding of how prisoner negotiations could be used to achieve military objectives. "Excellent. We now have justification for whatever measures are necessary to secure the release of federal personnel. Prepare for expanded operations against all Cherokee positions in the region." But Hayes's next words complicated Crawford's military calculations in ways that would force a different approach to the conflict. "There's more. The Cherokee are specifically requesting that Miss Morrison serve as a neutral mediator for prisoner negotiations. They claim she's the only white person in the region that Cherokee leadership trusts to facilitate honest communication." Sarah felt her heart race as she understood that Joseph or his allies had found a way to bring her into negotiations that might prevent the complete disaster Crawford was planning. The Cherokee request for her participation as a mediator would be difficult for federal authorities to refuse, especially if it offered hope for recovering federal prisoners without massive military casualties. Crawford studied the message with obvious suspicion, clearly recognizing that Cherokee demands for Sarah's participation suggested coordination between her and Cherokee leadership that went beyond her claimed role as an innocent rescue victim. "This confirms my suspicions about Miss Morrison's involvement with Cherokee resistance. They wouldn't request her specifically unless they believed she would advance their interests rather than federal interests." Hayes, however, saw the situation from a military perspective that prioritized the recovery of federal personnel over ideological concerns about Cherokee sympathizers. "Agent Crawford, regardless of Miss Morrison's sympathies, Cherokee willingness to negotiate suggests they recognize their position is untenable. We should explore this opportunity before committing to expanded military operations." The debate that followed revealed fundamental differences between military and political approaches to the Cherokee conflict. Hayes wanted to minimize federal casualties and restore order as quickly as possible, while Crawford was more concerned with establishing precedents that would discourage Native resistance to federal authority throughout the Indian territories. Sarah listened to their argument with growing understanding that she had become a crucial figure in negotiations that would determine not just the fate of Cherokee families in these mountains, but the broader federal approach to Native resistance across the continent. Her choices in the coming days would either help establish a model for peaceful resolution of removal conflicts, or provide justification for the kind of massive military intervention that would make the Trail of Tears look like a humanitarian gesture. "I'll do it," she said finally, interrupting their debate with quiet determination. "I'll serve as a mediator for prisoner negotiations, but only if both sides agree to honest communication and genuine effort to prevent further bloodshed." Crawford's response made clear that he saw prisoner negotiations primarily as an opportunity to gather intelligence and identify Cherokee leadership for future military action. Miss Morrison, you'll participate in these negotiations as a representative of federal authority, with instructions to gather information about Cherokee organization and capabilities while working toward prisoner release. Sarah understood that Crawford was attempting to use her as an unwitting intelligence agent, but she also recognized that participation in negotiations offered the best hope of preventing the massive escalation of violence that federal reinforcements would bring. I'll participate as a neutral mediator committed to preventing unnecessary death and suffering on both sides. The distinction was crucial, establishing Sarah's role as someone committed to humanitarian rather than military objectives. Crawford clearly wanted to object, but the presence of federal prisoners in Cherokee hands made some form of negotiation inevitable, and Sarah's unique position between the communities made her the obvious choice for mediator. As preparations began for prisoner negotiations that would take place in neutral territory between Cherokee and federal positions, Sarah found herself thinking about Joseph Ridge Walker and the impossible choices that had brought them all to this point. Somewhere in the mountains, he was probably making his own desperate calculations about how to protect Cherokee families while avoiding the kind of military confrontation that could only end in disaster for his people. The negotiations would begin at dawn, conducted in a meadow near Crying Rock Falls that held sacred significance for Cherokee people but was also within range of federal artillery positions. Both sides would arrive armed and suspicious, carrying the weight of recent bloodshed and the knowledge that failure to reach agreement would result in escalated violence that would consume innocent people on both sides. Sarah understood that. Her role as mediator placed her at the center of a conflict that transcended individual loyalties or personal relationships. The decisions made in those negotiations would determine whether Cherokee families found some way to remain in their ancestral homeland, or whether they would be driven onto the removal trail by military force that brooked no resistance. As night fell over the mountain valleys, Sarah prepared for what might be her final opportunity to prevent the complete catastrophe that federal policies had created. The leather pouch containing Joseph's artifacts had been returned to her as part of her role as mediator, and its weight reminded her that she carried not just Cherokee trust, but Cherokee hopes for survival in a world that seemed determined to erase them completely. Outside her window, the mountain peaks stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, holding their ancient secrets while human beings below struggled with conflicts that would determine whether Cherokee people would remain part of these mountains' future or become merely another chapter in their tragic past. Tomorrow would bring either the beginning of peace or the final escalation into a war that would leave scars on these mountains for generations to come. The sound of night birds calling across the valleys carried messages that transcended human language, speaking of continuity and survival that would outlast whatever choices were made in the coming dawn. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to find the strength she would need for the most important day of her life, a day when her words might determine whether the mountain mist would carry the smoke of peace fires or the ashes of a people's dreams. The first light of dawn brought with it the distant sound of Cherokee drums, calling the scattered bands together for what might be their final stand in the mountains. Their ancestors had called home for 1,000 years. Federal bugles answered from the opposite direction, summoning troops to positions that would either witness successful negotiations or the beginning of a war that would reshape the entire relationship between Native peoples and the expanding American nation. Sarah dressed carefully in clothes that would mark her as neither Cherokee nor white, but as someone who belonged to both communities and neither. Someone who carried the hopes of people who had learned to see enemies where they might have found allies. The sun rose higher, burning away the mountain mist and revealing a landscape that would either witness the triumph of human understanding over racial hatred, or the final victory of fear over compassion in the beautiful, terrible mountains of North Carolina. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.